December 29th, 2006. The number flashing across Treasury screen seems trivial. Britain just transferred $42.4 million to the United States and $9.98 million to Canada. The final installment, the last payment on loans borrowed 61 years earlier to prevent national collapse. With this electronic transfer, Britain officially closed the ledger on World War II. Except nobody was celebrating, because this wasn't just about repaying wartime debt. This was the final acknowledgement of a truth British politicians had spent a century denying. The British Empire didn't decline, it bankrupted itself. The bill came due in 2 installments separated by 25 years, both called World War. I'm not a historian. This isn't revisionist history. This is an examination of how the world's dominant economic superpower spent itself into irrelevance defending an empire that was already bleeding it dry. And how 2 world wars didn't destroy British power, they just made the bankruptcy impossible to hide anymore. The empire that couldn't pay for itself. August 1914. Britain enters World War I as the unquestioned economic giant of the planet. The pound sterling is the world's reserve currency. London is the center of global finance. British capital finances railways from Argentina to India. The Royal Navy rules the seas. British manufactured goods flood world markets. And the sun never sets on the Union Jack, flying over a quarter of Earth's surface and ruling nearly a quarter of its population. The textbooks stop there. What they don't mention is that this empire was a magnificent facade over a crumbling foundation. Britain wasn't rich despite its empire. It was going broke because of it. Here's what the schoolbooks miss. Before World War I, maintaining the British Empire cost vastly more than it generated. India, the so-called jewel in the crown, wasn't funding British prosperity. Britain was billing Indian taxpayers for the privilege of being ruled. Colonial military expenses, administrative costs, and infrastructure spending flowed one direction, out of London. When Britain fought wars of conquest in Afghanistan, China, or Sudan, the costs were charged wholly or mainly to Indian revenues, as economist Utsa Patnaik documents. The Indian Army was expansion by 30,000 troops in 1885, cost Indian taxpayers $30 million before it was ever used. A reserve force for imperial defense funded by some of the poorest people on Earth. British investors poured capital into imperial projects, railways in India, mines in Africa, plantations in Southeast Asia. But by 1914, the proportion of British capital invested in India had dropped from 19% in 1890 to just 10%. The empire was becoming less attractive even to British money. Meanwhile, protection costs escalated. Every new territory required garrisons, governors, and gunboats. Every rebellion needed suppression. Every rival required countering. The military expenditure that turned Britain into an empire was becoming the anchor dragging it down. But nobody in London wanted to admit the empire was a money pit. The prestige was too valuable. The strategic position too important. And the belief that somehow, eventually, it would all pay off remained unshakable. Even as the numbers told a different story. Silver Thursday for a Currency Friday, July 31st, 1914, London Stock Exchange closes for the first time in its 117-year history. Not because of military operations, because of financial panic. The Austria-Hungary ultimatum to Serbia triggered a scramble for liquidity that London couldn't handle. The Bank of England raised rates from 3% to 8% in days. It didn't matter. Credit markets froze. The empire that financed the world couldn't finance itself through a diplomatic crisis. When Britain declared war 4 days later, the government faced immediate fiscal reality. Defense spending since 1900 had fallen behind Germany in the arms race. The military wasn't prepared for continental war. And British national debt stood at $650 million, roughly 30% of GDP, low by later standards, but about to explode. The mechanics of Britain's wartime financing were aggressive, but not particularly complex. Income taxes quintupled. Before 1914, only 2% of the population paid income tax at a minuscule 6% rate. By 1918, income tax hit 30% and covered vastly more people. It wasn't enough. Tax revenue covered roughly 40% of war expenses. The rest required borrowing. War bonds generated approximately $300 million, about $19 billion in today's money. The government ran massive promotional campaigns. Patriotic posters screamed, "Feed our guns." Colorful certificates promised national pride in exchange for investment. Citizens responded. But the bonds were just the beginning. The real money came from America. Britain borrowed massively from the United States. At the war's worst point, Britain's budget deficit reached 49%. The Bank of England covered it with enormous American loans. By 1919, Britain's national debt had exploded from $650 million to $7.7 billion, an increase of over 1,000% in 5 years. More critically, Britain now owed the United States approximately $866 million at 1934 exchange rates, transform from global creditor to debtor nation. Strip away the victory parades, remove the territorial gains, ignore the League of Nations. What remains is mathematical catastrophe. Britain financed World War I by liquidating 2 centuries of accumulated wealth and mortgaging its future to America. The pound sterling never fully recovered, and the empire that emerged from Versailles was economically weaker than the one that entered in 1914, even as it claimed more territory than ever before. 1920, 1921. Britain suffered a recession that remains to this day the deepest the country has ever experienced. Not 2008, not the 1930s. The immediate post-World War I collapse was worse. Industrial production collapsed, unemployment spiked, export markets vanished, and the reason wasn't mysterious, it was mathematical. By the mid-1920s, interest on government debt absorbed 44% of all government expenditure, exceeding defense spending until 1937 when rearmament began. Read that again? Nearly half of everything the British government spent went to servicing debt from the previous war. Not building, not investing, not innovating, just paying interest on money borrowed to fight a war that ended years earlier. Britain's position in the global economy had been predicated on the globalization of the pre-war period. British capital exports, manufactured goods, and trade dominance required open markets and stable currencies. World War I shattered that system. The trade ratio fell by 12 percentage points. Countries like Japan and the United States replaced Britain in international markets during the war, developing industries that never gave those markets back. British cotton textiles, once dominant, faced permanent competition from producers who filled the void while British factories made shells instead of shirts. Britain attempted to restore its economic position by returning to the gold standard at pre-war parity. The move was economically suicidal. It overvalued the pound, making British exports expensive and imports cheap. British taxpayers delivered an average primary budget surplus of 7% of GDP during 1921 through 1929, but the debt-to-GDP ratio at the end of this period had risen to 1.58 compared to 1.47 at the start. Despite running massive surpluses year after year, the debt burden increased. Real interest rates exceeded real growth rates. Deflation made the nominal debt more expensive in real terms, and British workers paid the price through lower wages and higher unemployment. Britain never really recovered from World War I economically. The global superpower status continued as diplomatic fiction, while the economic foundation crumbled underneath. British politicians kept insisting the empire was strong. The numbers told a different story. And then the bill for the Second War arrived, the war that completed the bankruptcy. September 1939, Britain declares war on Germany. Again, and immediately faces the same problem as 1914, only worse. The military is unprepared. The economy is fragile. The debt from the last war is still suffocating government finances. And this time, the empire is even more expensive to defend. The mechanics of British World War II financing make World War I look restrained. In September 1939, after it became apparent Nazi Germany wasn't backing down, the pound plummeted from 4.61 to 3.99. Britain initially operated under cash and carry, buying American supplies with gold, dollars, or exported assets. By 1941, Britain had liquidated massive portions of its overseas holdings. Gold reserves depleted, dollar reserves evaporated, and American supplies were essential to survival. The Lend-Lease Act saved Britain from immediate collapse. President Roosevelt's program provided material for free on the basis that helping Britain was essential for American defense. But when World War II ended, so did Lend-Lease, abruptly, on August 21, 1945, with vast quantities of goods in transit, or already in Britain. The British economy, which had converted 55% of GDP to war production by 1944, had drastically reduced exports. Britain needed those supplies. It couldn't pay for them. Enter John Maynard Keynes. The brilliant economist, in poor health and shortly before his death, was sent to negotiate with the Americans. British politicians expected gratitude, expected recognition of Britain's sacrifice, expected favorable terms acknowledging that Britain fought from 1939 while America waited until 1941. They were wrong. Historian Alan Sked commented that the U.S. didn't seem to realize that Britain was bankrupt and that the loan was denounced in the House of Lords, but in the end, the country had no choice. America offered $3.75 billion at 2% interest over 50 years. Canada added $119 billion at the same terms. The loans included devastating conditions. Sterling had to become convertible within 1 year. This meant countries holding British pounds, particularly India and other colonies, could exchange them for dollars. The provision was catastrophic. On July 15, 1947, sterling became convertible. Within 1 month, nearly $1 billion drained from British dollar reserves as countries exchanged pounds for dollars. Britain was forced to suspend convertibility immediately and implement drastic spending cuts. The convertibility clause, meant to open British markets to American goods, instead exposed how weak the pound had become. In 1949, Britain devalued from $4.02 to $2.80, a 30% loss of purchasing power overnight. The pound had definitively lost its global reserve currency status. By the end of World War II, Britain's debt exceeded 200% of GDP, as it had after the Napoleonic Wars. But unlike after Waterloo, this time Britain didn't have an empire producing profit to pay down the debt. India gained independence in 1947. The colonies that Britain borrowed to defend were demanding freedom. The empire? Britain bankrupted itself protecting was dissolving even as the bills came due. The unspoken truth about imperial economics. Here's the part that British politicians couldn't admit publicly, but understood privately. From the 1st century CE to the start of British colonization in the 17th century, India's GDP varied between 25 and 35% of the world's total GDP. It dropped to 2% by the time Britain departed in 1947. Britain didn't develop India. Britain extracted from India while charging Indians for the extraction. The British system in India was economically perverse. After 1765, the East India Company collected taxes in India, then used roughly a third of those revenues to purchase Indian goods for British use. They weren't buying anything, they were confiscating with paperwork. Later, when the Crown took over, the system became more sophisticated but no less extractive. Council bills ensured payments for Indian exports went to London, where traders paid gold or silver to acquire them, while Indian producers were paid in rupees from their own tax revenues. India ran trade surpluses with the world, but showed deficits in colonial accounts because Britain appropriated the income. Britain used these extracted revenues to finance wars in China, suppress rebellions, and fund imperial expansion, charging the costs back to Indian taxpayers. The Indian Army's deployment in World War I sent 1.3 million soldiers and laborers to fight in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, funded by India. When World War II came, the pattern repeated. Keynes himself noted that failure to secure the 1945 loan would force Britain to abandon military outposts throughout the empire. The loan was needed not just for British reconstruction, but to maintain imperial positions Britain could no longer afford. The empire was a money-losing proposition, subsidized by extraction from the poorest colonies and paid for by British taxpayers, who believed the prestige was worth the cost. When 2 world wars required total mobilization, the illusion shattered. Britain couldn't simultaneously defend the empire and maintain solvency. The last payments were made on December 29, 2006, for the sum of about $83 million USD to the United States and about $23.6 million USD to Canada. 50 annual installments starting in 1950. Except Britain suspended payments 6 times, 1956, 1957, 1964, 1965, 1968, and 1976, because of economic crises, currency problems, and inability to meet obligations. The debt that was supposed to end in 2000 stretched to 2006. The total paid, including interest, exceeded $7.5 billion to America and $2 billion to Canada, roughly double the original amounts borrowed. Over 6 decades, British taxpayers serviced World War II debt while watching the empire dissolve, living standards stagnate, and economic leadership transfer to America. The loans financed Britain's survival through the war. They also financed 61 years of subordination to American economic power. And the World War I debts? They're still outstanding. In 1931, President Hoover announced a 1-year moratorium on war loan repayments due to the global economic crisis. But by 1934, Britain still owed the U.S. $4.4 billion of World War I debt. During the Great Depression, Britain ceased payments on these loans, and they remain outstanding. Nobody expects repayment. The debts exist in a curious state of limbo, technically owed, practically forgotten, a permanent reminder of financial catastrophe. Britain avoided bankruptcy in the technical sense. It made payments. It honored commitments. But avoid the word bankruptcy, and the reality remains unchanged. Britain liquidated its position as global economic superpower to finance 2 wars defending an empire that was already economically unsustainable. The military victories were real. The territorial control was real. The economic devastation was equally real. The prophecy nobody wanted to hear. December 29th, 2006. Ed Balls, Britain's economic secretary to the Treasury, issued formal thanks to the United States for its wartime support as the final payment cleared. The statement was gracious. Nobody mentioned that this payment concluded the longest loan repayment in British history. Nobody mentioned that Britain needed 61 years to pay off survival. Nobody mentioned that the empire Britain defended was gone decades before the debt was cleared. And nobody wanted to discuss the uncomfortable question underneath it all. What if defending the empire was never economically rational? What if British politicians knew it was unsustainable but couldn't imagine Britain without it? What if 2 world wars didn't destroy British power but simply made the existing bankruptcy impossible to deny? The British Empire reached its maximum territorial extent in the 1920s, right after World War I. The same war that exploded British debt, destroyed British export markets, and transferred economic leadership to America. Britain gained territory while losing wealth, acquired responsibility while exhausting resources, maintained prestige while mortgaging the future. By World War II, Keynes was warning of financial Dunkirk. British politicians were negotiating for loans to avoid abandoning imperial outposts. American negotiators understood what British pride couldn't accept. Britain was broke. The empire was unsustainable. The loan wasn't helping an ally. It was preventing the collapse of a debtor that happened to be strategically important. The difference between empire and bankruptcy is often just accounting and denial. Britain had the empire, the territory, the prestige, the history. What it didn't have was the economic foundation to sustain it once total war required honest accounting. And when the bills came due in 1919, in 1945, in 1949, and 2006, the truth was inescapable. Britain didn't lose its empire through moral failing or diplomatic mistakes. It spent the empire into bankruptcy, defending territory that cost more than it generated, fighting wars it couldn't afford, maintaining prestige it couldn't sustain. The sun never set on the British Empire because it burned through capital faster than sunlight. The uncomfortable conclusion. The final payment in 2006 wasn't closure, it was epilogue. By then, Britain's GDP was 1/5 of America's. The pound was a regional currency. British military spending depended on American security guarantees. The City of London survived as a financial center, but the empire that created it was a historical curiosity. British politicians spent the 20th century insisting the empire was temporary sacrifice, strategic necessity, noble burden. The numbers tell a different story. The empire was an economic disaster that British taxpayers subsidized for generations, defended in 2 catastrophic wars, and finally abandoned when maintaining it became literally unaffordable. This isn't about moral judgment. The British Empire was complex, simultaneously exploitative and developmental, brutal and bureaucratic, extractive and infrastructural. But economically, it was straightforward. Maintaining global territorial control costs more than distant colonies generate. Defending that control in total war costs more than any nation can afford. And pretending otherwise just delays the reckoning. The Hunt brothers tried to corner silver and went bankrupt when they couldn't service their leverage. Britain tried to maintain a global empire and went bankrupt when it couldn't service the defense costs. The mechanism is identical. Overextension, excessive leverage, inability to meet obligations, forced liquidation. The difference is scale and denial. So the Hunt brothers declared bankruptcy in 1988. Britain made its final World War II payment in 2006, but never used the word bankruptcy. 61 years of payments, 2 dissolved empires. Permanent subordination to American economic power. But never bankruptcy, because empires don't go bankrupt. They just keep making payments until there's nothing left to pay with. And then they call it decline, decolonization, or strategic reorientation. Anything but what it actually was. The British Empire didn't fall. It couldn't afford itself. The bills came due in 1914 and 1939. The payments lasted until 2006. And the world learned an expensive lesson. You cannot maintain global empire on borrowed money forever. Eventually, physics reasserts itself. And physics doesn't care about prestige. This is not revisionist history. This is just arithmetic. When defense costs exceed economic capacity year after year, debt accumulates. When debt accumulates faster than growth, the burden becomes unsustainable. When war requires total mobilization, the truth becomes unavoidable. The British Empire was magnificent, powerful, and historically significant. It was also, from an economic perspective, a bankruptcy in slow motion. December 29th, 2006 wasn't the end of British decline. It was just the day Britain stopped pretending the empire had been affordable. The difference is subtle but important, and the lesson is universal. Empires are expensive. Wars are expensive. Pretending you can afford both simultaneously is how superpowers become debtors. Britain made its final payment. The empire is history. But the warning remains. The true price of empire isn't measured in territory or prestige. It's measured in debt, dependence, and decades of payments to the people who bailed you out when reality finally arrived. This is not a cautionary tale. This is a receipt. And it took 61 years to settle.